Committee will come to order. We'll be voting on a number of amendments, and the list is being printed up now. The first order of business will be the en bloc amendment. The first will be a roll call number 18, amendment numbers 27 and 28, offered by Representative Shalala and Thompson. Say again? Thompson 42. Requires the Shalala amendment requires a JEL study of state licensing restrictions related to federal student loan defaults. The Thompson amendment supports capacity building for career and technical education programs. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
Aye.
Chairman Scott votes aye. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes aye. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSagne? Mr. DeSagne? Mr. DeSagne votes aye. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes aye. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes aye. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes aye. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes aye. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes aye. Ms. Omar? Mr. Trone? Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes aye. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes aye. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes aye. Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
And the clerk read the names of those who are not recorded. The clerk read the names of those not recorded.
Mr. Grijalva? Ms. Wilson? Ms. Adams? Ms. Omar? Mr. Trone? Mr. Walker? Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Muser?
Is Ms. Wilson recorded?
Ms. Wilson is not recorded. Ms. Wilson votes aye.
Is Mr. Fulcher recorded?
Mr. Fulcher is not recorded. Mr. Fulcher votes aye.
Is Mrs. Adams recorded?
Ms. Adams is not recorded. Ms. Adams votes aye.
Go to Thompson.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 45 yeas, 0 nays.
45 ayes, 0 nays. The amendment en bloc is agreed to. The next is roll call number, we have it as 19, amendment number 29. Representative Thompson, number 67, allows for nonprofits to participate in short-term Pell program. Thompson, 67.
It was next on the order.
The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Desanye? Mr. Desanye votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Mr. Underwood? Mr. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Mr. Trone? Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mr. Strahan? Mr. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Mr. Stefanik? Mr. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 20 yeas, 25 nays.
20 ayes, 25 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The next, we're going to take up 35 and then 36. 35 is the Allen Amendment Number 5, prohibits a school from offering in-state tuition or reduced fee rate to a person not lawfully present in the United States. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSanya? Mr. DeSanya votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Ms. Schreier? Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Mr. Trone? Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Mr. Stefanik? Mr. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
How is Mr. Grijalva recorded?
Mr. Grijalva is not recorded. No. Mr. Grijalva votes no.
How is Ms. Omar recorded?
Ms. Omar is not recorded. Ms. Omar votes no.
Is anyone not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 19 yeas, 26 nays.
19 yeas, 26 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The next will be roll call 36, number 37, Representative Comer's Amendment number 18. It prohibits borrowers who are convicted of a crime against children as determined by the Secretary from accessing public service loan forgiveness and teacher loan forgiveness. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSanya? Mr. DeSanya votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Ms. Schreier? Ms. Underwood? Mrs. Hayes? Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Strahan? Mrs. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
How's Mr. Trone recorded?
Mr. Trone is not recorded. Mr. Trone votes no.
Is anyone not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 20 yeas, 24 nays.
20 ayes, 24 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment is, Mr. Banks? Roll call number 20, amendment number 30, Representative Banks, 51. Prevents a bill from taking effect until the Secretary of Education certifies that it will not negatively impact military recruitment and limit veterans' access to education. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Jacano? Mr. Jacano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. Desanye? Mr. Desanye votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mr. Strahan? Mr. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
How is Mr. Grothman recorded?
Mr. Grothman is not recorded. Mr. Grothman votes aye.
Is anyone else not recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 20 yeas, 26 nays.
20 ayes, 26 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Next amendment is roll call number 21, Amendment 31, Grothman 48. Adds a Title VI eligibility restriction. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablan? Mr. Sablan votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSanya? Mr. DeSanya votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 20 yeas, 26 nays.
20 ayes, 26 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The next is roll call number 22, amendment number 32, Grothman 66, imposes student loan limits and provides discretion to financial aid administrators to increase loan amounts for special circumstances. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablan? Mr. Sablan votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSanya? Mr. DeSanya votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Ms. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mr. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 21 yeas, 26 nays.
21 ayes, 26 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The next is roll call number 23, amendment number 33, Representative Grothman, number 68. It strikes the requirement for grantees to provide students information on SNAP eligibility. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSanye? Mr. DeSanye votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mr. Strahan? Mr. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 21 yeas, 26 nays.
21 ayes, 26 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Next is roll call number 24, amendment number 34. Representative Allen, amendment number 37, requires the state receiving a partnership grant to certify that neither the state nor its cities or counties limit cooperation with federal immigration authorities to protect undocumented individuals. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSanye? Mr. DeSanye votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mr. Strahan? Mr. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 21 yeas, 25 nays.
21 ayes, 25 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Next amendment is number 25, amendment number 26. Representative Stefanik, amendment 24, replaces the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. Desanye? Mr. Desanye votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Strahan? Mrs. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? Is anyone not recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 22 yeas, 26 nays.
22 ayes, 26 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Next amendment is 26, 38A. It is the Comer amendment, but we'll first vote on Representative Bonamici's second-degree amendment. Her amendment amends the Comer amendment on background checks to align with Clery Act disclosure requirements. We'll be voting on the amendment to the amendment offered by Ms. Bonamici. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
Aye.
Chairman Scott votes aye. Mrs. Davis? Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes aye. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes aye. Ms. Adams? Mr. Desanye? Mr. Desanye votes aye. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes aye. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes aye. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes aye. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes aye. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes aye. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes aye. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes aye. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes aye. Mrs. Strahan? Mrs. Strahan votes aye. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes aye. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes no. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes no. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes no. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes no. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes no. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes no. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes no.
Is anyone not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 26 yeas, 22 nays.
26 ayes, 22 nays. The amendment to the amendment is agreed to. The question now is on the Comer Amendment, number 47, requiring institutions to disclose campus policies regarding required background checks for employees, volunteers, and requires campuses to conduct background checks for employees and volunteers working with athletes, children, and youth, as amended by the Bonamici Amendment. All those that favor the amendment as amended will say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment is number 27, amendment number 39, it's Comer number 69, strikes a requirement for institutions seeking religious exemptions to Title IX to make disclosures to students. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSanya? Mr. DeSanya votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Ms. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Strahan? Mr. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 22 yeas, 26 nays.
26 ayes, 22 ayes, 26 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Next amendment is roll call number 28, amendment number 40, offered by Representative Johnson. Number 33 mandates at least one public member on the accreditation board represents business. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSanya? Mr. DeSanya votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Strahan? Mrs. Strahan votes aye. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Mr. Stefanik? Mr. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Mrs. Wilson recorded?
Ms. Wilson is not recorded. Ms. Wilson votes aye. Ms. Wilson votes no.
Clerk report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 23 yeas, 25 nays.
23 ayes, 25 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Next is roll call number 25, Amendment 42, offered by Representative Johnson. Number 39 requires institutions to certify that any healthcare practitioner at a healthcare facility affiliated with an institution will approve medical care to any infant born alive at such facility. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSanye? Mr. DeSanye votes no. Ms. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mr. Strahan? Mr. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Aye. Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded?
Mr. Grossman.
Is anyone not recorded? If not, the clerk will report. Excuse me. Gentleman from Alabama, how is he recorded, Mr. Byrne?
Mr. Byrne votes aye.
Anyone else not recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 22 yeas, 26 nays.
22 ayes, 26 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The next is roll call number 30, Amendment 43. Representative Fulcher, number 4, strikes the gainful employment provisions in the bill. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSanye? Mr. DeSanye votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Jayapal? Mr. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mr. McBath? Mr. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mr. Strahan? Mr. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
How's Mr. Byrne recorded?
Mr. Byrne is not. Mr. Byrne votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 22 yeas, 25 nays.
22 ayes, 25 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment is roll call 31, Amendment 44, Representative Walker, number 25. It excludes 529 college savings plans from the FAFSA. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSanye? Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes aye. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Strahan? Mrs. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
How's Ms. Adams recorded?
No.
Ms. Adams votes no.
How's Ms. Stefanik recorded?
Ms. Stefanik is voted as no. Ms. Stefanik votes aye.
How's Mr. Allen recorded?
Mr. Allen is recorded as no. Mr. Allen votes aye.
How is Ms. Davis recorded?
Mrs. Davis is not recorded. Mrs. Davis votes no.
Is anyone not recorded? Clerk will report. Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 22 yeas, 26 nays.
22 ayes, 26 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The next is an en bloc vote on roll call number 32, amendment number 46, Representative Klein, number 21. It applies the newly created adjusted cohort default rate at the program level. And amendment number 50, Representative Muser, number 20, provides a 2-year transition exception to the adjusted cohort default rate benchmark for all institutions rather than only public institutions, HBCUs, and private institutions with a Pell enrollment of at least 45%. This is an en bloc amendment for those 2 amendments. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Mr. Levin? No. Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mr. Trahan? Mr. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 22 yeas, 24 nays.
22 ayes, 24 nays. The amendment en bloc is not agreed to. Next is roll call number 33, Amendment 47, offered by Representative Klein, number 53. Strikes Part D of the bill, establishes a new loan program that lowers borrowing limits and eliminates loan forgiveness for new borrowers. It also makes changes to the cohort default rate and accreditation. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablan? Mr. Sablan votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. Desagne? Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mr. Strahan? Mr. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes no. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes no. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes no. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? How is Ms. McBath recorded?
Mrs. McBath votes no.
Gentleman from Wisconsin, how is Mr. Grothman recorded?
Mr. Grothman is recorded as no. Mr. Grothman votes aye.
Anyone else not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 9 yeas, 37 nays.
9 ayes, 37 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The next is roll call number 34, amendment number 48, offered by Representative Watkins, number 65. It strikes the provisions that require accreditors to assess success with respect to student achievement by measuring completion, progress towards completion, and workforce participation outcomes. Clerk will report.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablan? Mr. Sablan votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Desagne? Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Mr. Levin? Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mr. Strahan? Mr. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? How's Mr. Levin recorded?
Mr. Levin is not recorded.
How's Mr. Levin recorded?
Mr. Levin is not recorded? No. Mr. Levin votes no.
How is Ms. Shalala recorded?
Ms. Shalala is not recorded? Ms. Shalala votes no.
Is anyone else not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 22 yeas, 26 nays.
22 ayes, 26 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The next is roll call number 35, Amendment 35, offered by Representative Allen, number 5, prohibits the school from offering.
We already did that one.
I'm sorry. Number 37, Amendment 49. No?
Yeah, that one.
Okay. Offered by Representative Muser, number 7, eliminates the requirement that the Secretary enter a memorandum of understanding with the Private Education Loan Ombudsman at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Chicano? Mr. Chicano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Destanye? Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Strahan? Mrs. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? Anyone not recorded? How is Mr. Levin recorded?
Mr. Levin is not recorded? Mr. Levin votes no.
Anyone else not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 22 yeas, 26 nays.
22 ayes, 26 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Next is roll call number 38, amendment number 51, offered by Mr. Keller. Number 30, removes the requirement that for-profit institutions derive at least 15% of revenue from sources other than federal education assistance funds, and strikes the revenue formula to calculate 8515. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Destanya? Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded?
Mr. Levin votes no.
And Mr. Grijalva?
Mr. Grijalva is not recorded. Mr. Grijalva votes no.
Is anyone else not recorded? Is Mr. Takano recorded?
Mr. Takano is recorded as no.
Yes, he's voting no. Anyone else not recorded? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 22 yeas, 26 nays.
22 ayes, 26 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The next is roll call number 39, Amendment 52, offered by Representative Keller, number 31, allowing institutions to outsource educational programs to ineligible entities. Clerk will report. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Desanye? Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Strahan? Mrs. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? Is Mr. Levin recorded?
Mr. Levin is not recorded. No. Mr. Levin votes no.
Is anyone else not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 22 yeas, 26 nays.
22 ayes, 26 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Next is roll call number 40, amendment number 53, offered by Representative Murphy. Adds a sense of Congress that professors should remove their political biases from the classroom. Clerk will report.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes aye.
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? No. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Desanye? Mr. Norcross? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Strahan? Mr. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy?
Is anyone,
Mr. Murphy votes aye.
excuse me, is anyone not recorded? How is Mr. Norcross recorded?
Mr. Norcross is not recorded.
And how is Mr. Levin recorded?
Mr. Norcross votes no.
Right.
Mr. Norcross votes no.
And
Mr. Levin votes no.
are there others not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 22 yeas, 26 nays.
22 ayes, 26 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment is roll call number 41, amendment number 54, offered by Mr. Representative Murphy. Number 46 requires institutions to disclose when non-instructional spending increases by more than 5% year over year. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
Aye.
Chairman Scott votes
Aye.
aye. Mrs. Davis? Aye. Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Aye. Mr. Grijalva votes aye. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes aye. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. Desanye? Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Norcross votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Mr. Morelli? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes aye. Mrs. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes aye. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes aye. Mr. Levin? Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes aye. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes aye. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes aye. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes aye. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes aye. Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Aye. Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Anyone not recorded? How is the gentleman from Michigan recorded? Mr. Levin?
Mr. Levin is not recorded. Mr. Levin votes aye.
Is anyone else not recorded?
You voted on that.
Anyone else not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 47 yeas, 0 nays.
47 ayes, 0 nays. The amendment is agreed to. The next roll call is number 42, amendment number 2, offered by the gentlelady from North Carolina, the ranking member, Ms. Fox. It's an amendment in nature of a substitute for the entire bill. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mr. Trahan? Mr. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes no. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Are there others? Okay. Is anyone else not recorded?
Mr. Comer votes aye.
Is anyone else not recorded? Recorded? Is- Is anyone else not recorded? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 21 yeas, 27 nays.
21 ayes, 27 nays. The amendment nature of a substitute offered by the gentlelady from North Carolina is not adopted. The question now is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. All in favor of the amendment in nature of substitute as amended will vote aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment in nature of a substitute is agreed to. We now,
Can I strike the last word this time?
gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say that I came to Congress to serve on the Education Committee, and I come with a background steeped in education. I was Executive Director for Dropout Prevention and Alternative Education for Miami-Dade County Public Schools. I served on the school board. I was a school principal and a school teacher and a Head Start director. And when I came to Congress, I came to make life better for children and to make education better for them. And all the time I have served on this committee, I got the impression that all of us had that same goal. But this year, something happened. And first of all, I'm not sure if it's our Secretary of Education, Mr. Vos. I'm not sure if it's her. I'm not sure if it's because we're in the process of impeaching the president. But I've never seen such horrible amendments aimed at hurting children. Children who we know have to depend on a school for a meal. Children who we know need their student loan debt modified.
Excuse me, the gentlelady will suspend. It would be appropriate to address the amendments and not the motives of the...
Well, Mr. Chair, I just had to get that off my chest because some Republican children go hungry, Democratic children go hungry, and all of the amendments that came through these 2 days, I've never seen anything like this. This is unprecedented, and I hope this is not the future of the Education Committee. I'm disgusted.
There being no other members to speak on the bill, I now entertain a motion to report the bill and recognize the gentlelady from California.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I move the Committee on Education and Labor report the Bill 4674 to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and the bill, as amended, do pass.
Question now occurs on reporting H.R. 4674 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All in favor will say aye. Aye. All opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
We asked for a recorded vote, Mr. Chair.
And a recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll. Aye.
Chairman Scott votes aye. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes aye. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes aye. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. Desanya? Mr. Desanya votes aye. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes aye. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes aye. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes aye. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes aye. Mrs. Hayes? Yes. Mrs. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes aye. Mr. Levin? Aye. Mr. Levin votes aye. Ms. Omar? Aye. Ms. Omar votes aye. Mr. Trone? Aye. Mr. Trone votes aye. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes aye. Mr. Strahan? Mrs. Strahan votes aye. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes aye. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes no. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes no. Mr. Comer? Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes no. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes no. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes no. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes no. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes no.
How is Mr. Comer?
Mr. Comer
recorded?
votes, Mr. Comer votes no.
Is anyone not recorded? Is the clerk recorded everybody on the committee? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 28 yeas, 22 nays.
28 ayes, 22 nays. The bill is reported. As have it, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 4674 is ordered reported to the House of Representatives, and the chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I now recognize myself to ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill as amended pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L. I give notice to all members that they have the requisite number of days to file the supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views. Without objection, so ordered. There being no further business before the committee, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.